The African education system is crafted to erase the horrors of colonialism, painting the European invaders as benevolent heroes who rescued the black race from savagery. This manipulation of history is meant to suppress the truth, glorifying oppressors while hiding their atrocities. Despite this, the resilience of the African spirit endures. A new generation of Africans awakened and determined is passing on the true history, ensuring that the painful legacy of colonialism is neither forgotten nor repeated. France remains a notorious figure inflicting suffering on its former African colonies. Trapped in a relentless cycle of pain and dependency that France, Britain, and the United States refuse to end, African nations have begun to revolt against the enduring chains of neo-colonialism. The struggle for genuine independence and self-determination is more crucial than ever. This is the story of what Africans had to endure at the hands of Western Europeans right after gaining independence. A tale of enduring pain and endless struggle. In late 1972 in West Africa, Benin declared itself a Marxist state. President Mathieu Kérékou nationalized the country's oil. The French government was outraged, asserting that there could not be a communist African state and that Benin's natural resources belonged to France. In response, the French organized a coup d'etat to remove the African president. Bob Denard, a mercenary, was chosen for the operation under the supervision of the French ambassador Maurice Delaunay. Western coups d'etats aimed at toppling African governments are often executed through their ambassadors and heads of NGOs. Bob Denard was experienced in destabilizing Africa. He fought in the Congo in the early 1960s to secure the Katanga mines for Western European control. Bob was the right man to call on to get rid of the Benin president. In 1977, the mercenary assembled a team of 100 men trained in Gabon to storm the presidential palace. The Soviet Union, a true friend of Africans, tipped off the Benin president about the imminent French coup. Bob's team was outnumbered and outsmarted by the Benin army. The mercenary fled to Gabon, embarrassed by his failure. The French government later arrested Bob Denard for his failed coup in the West African nation. In 1965, Jean-Bédel Bokassa seized power in the Central African Republic. The country was a key colonial territory of France, with large military bases used to police neighboring African countries. Strategically located in the middle of Africa, Central African Republic made it easy to deploy European troops to topple any African government deemed a threat to European interests on the continent. The French president Valéry Giscard d'Estaing was a close friend of Bokassa, and he would travel to meet him personally to ensure that the country's natural resources were secured for the Europeans. In 1977, the same year the French government tried to get rid of the Benin president, Bokassa declared himself an emperor with absolute power. The coronation was subsidized by France and cost over $13 million, which, adjusted for inflation, would be $65.3 million today. No heads of state attended the ceremony. They were represented by ambassadors, but France's Minister of Cooperation was present. Many African countries were outraged by French politics on the continent. The vast majority of Africans did not recognize Bokassa's empire. Valéry Giscard realized his mistake and decided to replace Bokassa. He withdrew his support for the new emperor, prompting Bokassa to turn to Muammar Gaddafi of Libya for support. The French president chose one of his loyal, trained, and educated African supporters living in France to be the new president of the Central African Republic. His name was David Dacko. David Dacko was dispatched from Paris on September 1979 to the Central African Republic, accompanied by French Secret Service officers. When Emperor Bokassa was on an official visit to Libya to meet with Muammar Gaddafi for support, the French initiated Operation Barracuda. David Dacko was driven by the French Secret Service to the presidential palace, and the coup was announced. The Central African Empire is no more. French television announced the coup the same hour it happened.
Mesdames, Messieurs, bonsoir. Il n'y a plus d'empire centrafricain, il n'y a plus d'empereur, il n'y a plus de Bokassa Ier. Le dictateur de Bangui a été limogé cette nuit. C'est en Libye qu'il a appris sa déchéance.
Here is another truth about African countries you need to know. Armed Europeans can walk in and out of African heads of state palaces without being stopped. African heads of state are powerless against European powers. It is still a relationship of master and slave. Nothing has changed since decolonization. When François Mitterrand came to power in France, he changed the old brutal France-Afrique tactics of controlling African countries. G. Penn, Mitterrand's new chief advisor, developed a theory based on African love for mysticism and the supernatural. The idea was to include African heads of state in secret cults to pledge allegiance and loyalty to Europeans. By the 1980s, all heads of state in former French colonies were officially made members of these cults. The Brotherhood did not consider themselves Africans anymore. The African puppet leaders committed all sorts of atrocities against their own citizens because their allegiance lay with the Europeans. The fall of the Soviet Union in 1991 was a disaster for African countries. The Soviets were the only allies the Africans relied on to fight off Western imperialism on the continent. It is important to note that the Soviets provided all the guns and ammunition to African countries to fight for their independence, a grudge Western powers still carry against the Russian Republic today. In 1994, the French company Elf was finally exposed by a whistleblower. Every major act of corruption and covert operations implicating high-level government officials funded by the company were exposed to the public. The world was horrified by the actions of France and other European powers on the African continent. Africans across the continent asked the Europeans to stop funding and choosing leaders that served their interests. The Soviet Union is no more, and there is no justification for Western powers to still occupy the continent under the pretext of combating communism. Hope finally emerged in Africa as France's monopoly over the energy market in its former colonies began to crumble. China offered an alternative to Africa, a win-win cooperation based on mutual respect. France and other Western powers would finally leave the African continent, and Africa would finally flourish and develop. A series of conferences and summits in French-speaking African countries were organized by pro-democratic groups to challenge all Western puppet presidents and possibly remove them from power. In Gabon, Omar Bongo, the man who had held power for over 30 years, was enraged at his Western masters for leaving him at the mercy of the democratic revolutionary groups who wanted him out of power.
Venez marcher avec nous, pour qu'ensemble nous luttions, pour qu'ensemble nous renversions le despote.
In May 1990, the leader of the opposition in Gabon, Joseph Renjambe, was assassinated by Bongo's men in a hotel room. Suspecting that Elf had a hand in the assassination, the Gabonese people stormed the French company headquarters in Port-Gentil. Many employees, accused of being French collaborators and traitors to the African people, were stripped naked and paraded all over town as symbols of black traitors and European lovers. Elf reacted by shutting down the oil field in Gabon and asking President Omar Bongo to stop the riots or face a coup d'etat. Bongo appeared on national television, assuring the French that he would eliminate his own people without hesitation to show his loyalty to the French government.
Ce n'est pas parce qu'il y a des manifestations de rue que cela doit mener la fin des règnes. Moi, je ne me laisserai pas faire. Nous sommes décidés à mettre de l'ordre, quel qu'en soit le prix. C'est tout.
Bongo also threatened France to hand over the African oil to the United States, as if Gabon's wealth belonged to him. France sent the Foreign Legion to fight the African freedom fighters. Port-Gentil was encircled and the rebellion was crushed. The Africans who blockaded the European quarters were eliminated in cold blood. The French army regained control of Gabon and Omar Bongo regained control of the country. The same tactics were recently used in New Caledonia to regain control of the island nation. The Kanaks who called for independence were shot, and their leader Christian Tine was taken to France and imprisoned. In Congo-Brazzaville, in Central Africa, President Sassou Nguesso was also hit by riots. The citizens were determined to oust their puppet leader and take control of the oil fields. The president had no chance of winning the upcoming elections, so the French government came up with a solution to keep him in office by sharing power with the former Prime Minister Pascal Lissouba, who came from a majority ethnic group in the country. After winning the election, Lissouba betrayed the French government that funded his campaign through ELF. He refused to share power with Nguesso. Fearing retaliation from the French government, the new president Lissouba signed agreements with the American company Oxy to have a U.S. military base in the country for protection in exchange for 10 years of oil production. The American company paid Lissouba $150 million to help him pay the military, who hadn't been paid for months. ELF armed former President Nguesso's loyalists to fight Lissouba. A civil war broke out from 1993 until 1997. The president of Angola, José dos Santos, backed by the French company ELF, provided support to Denis Sassou Nguesso. Angola, also an oil-producing nation with massive reserves, saw dos Santos, who had just won a civil war in Angola, send troops to Congo-Brazzaville at France's request to rescue Sassou Nguesso. France's chosen puppet was reinstated. The villains regained their foothold in the African country. The world watched powerlessly, and the United Nations is complicit in all France's crimes in Africa. African lives mean nothing to them. The continent is, after all, the playground of Western powers. In the year 2000, more whistleblowers exposed transactions from Switzerland made by the French company ELF to African heads of state for the complete control of their respective countries. 3 magistrates pushed for justice, and finally, ELF was brought to justice. The company was liquidated and absorbed by smaller companies. ELF became ELF Total Energies. But this was not the end of France in Africa. France is not done tormenting black people. The chains of colonialism may have been broken, but the shackles of neo-imperialism still bind.